Hey, welcome back, everybody. My name is Chad Jennings. I'm the head of product experience and customer voice for IBM Software. And today I'm joined by Katarina Gospic and Petri, and I'm going to let you do your last name, who are from Edsvärd. And we're going to go through their use case and some interesting things that they built and learned in the process of building some tools for real estate. So, Katarina, I'll welcome you first. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and your role.
My name is Katarina Gospic. I actually have a medical background and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, but I'm the co-founder of Edsvärd, and I work in operations as a CTO.
And Petri, please.
Yeah, Petri Sysilahti. I'm a solution architect and a product manager for the contract intelligence.
Could you please just go ahead and describe the use case that we're going to discuss here and the problem that it solves?
This use case started with the real estate owner. So as you all know, there are lots of contracts within real estate. So everything that you rent out, no matter if it's a space or a parking lot, comes with a contract. And with that said, it's difficult to keep track of everything. And also, when you use different real estate management systems, that information is put in manually. So this causes lots of errors, information goes missing, and in the end, it causes financial leakage.
Can you describe a little bit about the solution that you came to market with to solve the problem?
Our solution is called contract intelligence. So with the help of AI, we can extract information from contracts, and then we can actually cross-check it with other information sources like invoices, ledgers, energy declarations, notifications, and so on. So then we can find proofs where things deviate, and then you can take action from that. And it might sound strange, but lots of things are deviating. So in the end, it's all about getting paid. And what you can actually get paid is stated in the contract. But as this information gets missing, and also contracts looks very, very different. So in the end, there are lots of human errors. But with AI, we can then capture this information in a better way. And what's interesting is that it's not only about the figures that we can extract and cross-check, but we can also identify, for example, texts in these contracts, which can then flag for a risk. Because even if you have really good numbers, let's say you get lots of money in, but if there is a clause in your contract stating that if something goes wrong, you as a real estate owner should pay for that, then that becomes a high-risk contract. But if you can also identify these risks in your contracts can become better over time as well.
Risk mitigation is a key aspect of like any kind of business endeavor. And so keeping an eye on those and having tools that help you keep an eye on those, and then sounds like even write them out of the next version of the contract entirely sounds incredibly helpful. While we were prepping this, we talked a little bit about the difference between investigating contracts and a similar document like an invoice. Can you speak to how your company's kind of, looked at both of those use cases?
Yes, so what's very unique with our AI, so everyone says that they can kind of make data actionable. And what's unique with our system is that we are really good at unstructured data. So that is usually the most difficult part, because if it's structured, it's more straightforward. But it's said, for example, that 99% of business data is either used for analysis or for AI. And the majority of all of that data is then unstructured. So that has been very difficult. But our methodology is that we have an annotation system. So this allows us to extract this information. And what has been very fun during the process is that our customers also teaches us that it's not just the information then from the contracts that's interesting, but also the information from the invoices. So financial institutions are particularly interested in that part.
Interesting. And so can you describe a particular question that either on a contracting use case or on analysis on invoices, a particular question that your customer would ask, like, I'm interested in like the sum total of my invoices for a particular category. Can you give us an example?
So one thing that you want to do is, of course, know your income, to see your budgets, what's coming in. But then you also want to do different types of prognosis. So that's kind of the most straightforward. A second thing is that when you have a building, for example, you make the different tenants share, for example, the heat costs or waste costs and so on. But that can actually be a bit difficult to know who should pay what and what type of share. And it's very different if you are, a company that's just renting an office space versus you are a restaurant, because then you consume electricity and waste and heat and water and so on very differently. So this type of system can also create a common calculation model for that. So it becomes more fair, more straightforward, and so on. Then there is also a great value if you're gonna sell a building or buy a building, or if you are a bank, and all of these parties sometimes want to do due diligence in these types of transactions. So contract intelligence also helps with giving you more granular data, so you get a better basis for decision making.
Okay, Petri, let's shift over to you. And why don't you walk us through this architecture diagram, please?
Sure, happy to. This is more of a functional diagram, I would say, but as a core, we have a two component system. We have the source, in this case, the samporten, which contains all of the documentation that we have already available, the contracts, all the related information and documents.
Those are like PDFs or Word documents. Like this is the unstructured stuff that Katarina was discussing.
That's the unstructured stuff, as you put it. Yeah. Mostly PDF, but they could be Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints. Somebody could have taken a picture, their phone. So it's there's a lot of variance in there. Then we have the other side, the AI, the contract intelligence, which is available through an API. And the purpose, if you look at it from the outside, is you feed a contract in, and then you get structured data telling you what's important in that contract back to the API.
Okay, so just to review, so the samporten is the document store, and that's up at the top. And then the contract intelligence or the invoice intelligence, right? Because Katarina described those two use cases, is in the lower kind of green, white border box.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And those two boxes in here actually have a significance. So they highlight that partly the solution is running in IBM Cloud as a service, but it can also be run on top of watsonx data, on top of any other cloud provider, and also on-prem when that's needed.
Can you talk briefly about the on-prem requirements, or like what kinds of situations is it required that this whole thing be deployed on-prem?
Yeah. So originally this was fully cloud-based because the understanding was that that's what most clients would want. But it turns out that there's a legislative and privacy concerns that most of the bigger clients actually insist on having it on-prem or in a private cloud at least, which makes it quite interesting in terms of the requirements and the level of variance there is, and the requirements for the capabilities to scale both, out and scale up, and also to be really highly available.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing this pattern, by the way, in a number of in other companies that we work with here, at IBM, and that the situations where, the hybrid cloud architecture is required for either privacy or data sovereignty or security or some other reason, enforces the systems to be running both on-prem and in the cloud. But very interesting, and also very organic, right? That requirement, like it started in the cloud, and then the requirement came from your customers to pull some of this traffic back on-prem. Can you walk us through some of the functions here that, so,
Sure.
unstructured PDFs go in one side, we go through all this magic, and then you get structured data back. So, walk us through the magic, please.
Yeah, well, it's actually boring. Even it's so simple when you look at it, afterwards. But we start with extracting the text from the document, whatever it might be. If it's a text-based document, we just pull the text out. If it's an image, we do OCR and other things that are required to be able to get to the actual text on the document. Then we do some preparation to the text to make it compatible with our AI tooling. We do some name entity recognition and then so on and so forth. Then we are using the annotations. So then we come to our custom AI, and it's built on a tailored language model based on that we have built based on the language requirements for each sort of client type. And then on top of that, we have built it with domain-specific specific documentation, as well as client-specific, fine-tuning where these annotations come in. So we're able to extract from the documents the things that actually matter in this use case. For instance, in contracts, that might be, contract numbers, validity periods, the area of the properties, how many different how many different sections of a building the customer might have rented, what's the rent, how much time there is before the termination date to renew the contract, and so on. So we extract all those data points. So we create structure from the unstructured, and then we use that information to build sort of an accurate state of the contract that represents the contract as an object that has different properties and different has meaning to it that we can then further utilize, and then we store that state sort of in a time series database to make it available to dashboards and reports and analysis.
Okay, that makes total sense. I'm going to ask you some questions about the specific boxes here as we go. Which tooling do you use? I'm guessing that the custom AI is a particular LLM from one of the providers with your custom embeddings.
And that's actually a completely custom model
Okay,
built
so
from the ground up. Yeah. And then it's sort of a three-tier process where we first have trained a sort of a basic language model using the languages that we know are going to be used, because that will give us a better accuracy on those languages instead of using all of the possible ones that were available. And we have many different models depending on what geographical areas and use cases we're targeting. And then on top of the foundation language model, we have a domain-specific further training, where, for instance, in the contract intelligence space, we train it with a variety of different contract types, so it understands the concept of contracts as well as possible.
Did you start with a particular foundation model, or did you create your own just for
this one is completely custom. Yeah, for the RAG use cases that we have built on top of this one, there we are using Llama, for instance, as a base model. But for this case, we saw that we have tried different models, but it turns out that building your own is in this case the best option. Not the easiest one, not the quickest one, but the outcome is the best.
And I think this is kind of important to highlight because, as we all know, AI is about accuracy. So when we use this type of methodology, we get the accuracy. And that's something that's very unique to our company. And then when you fine-tune it with the customer's own data, we reach amazing levels. And a while ago, we were in a meeting with a very big company, and they told us that they had extracted like 3 values with what it was 97% accuracy. But at that point, we had 127 values. So this type of methodology is very effective to really extract what's important, and then with this high accuracy, which is it's all about.
I was just going to make a point, politely contradicting Katarina, what you said. AI is actually fundamentally a stochastic process, right? Particularly these large language models, right? They're based on probabilities and what's the most likely next thing. And so, that's one of the reasons why over the last years, accuracy has been a trade-off with these large language models. So that was my polite disagreement. But you're exactly correct, right? And customers or partners, folks in the industry are having to do things like this to find ways to generate the accuracy that their use cases require, and sometimes having to go to great lengths, like in this case, building your own AI from the ground up. Anyway, my compliments. That's most folks are choosing to use a foundation model and then put embeddings or like training it in domain specific ways. This one is not as common.
Yeah. But I don't actually think that we are disagreeing, because I totally agree that it's the most probable answer, but you can have kind of an accuracy to your most probable answer. So that is what we are pushing for, to really be on top of that.
Yeah, I think there's two different, actually two things with the foundation models that are a bit of a showstopper. One being that they're usually not deterministic, meaning that they always don't produce the same output from the same input. And also, if you're doing, for instance, invoice handling, it's not okay to get 95% of the rows correct.
Yeah.
And the missing 5% can mean a lot of things. So we need to get them all.
Naturally.
Yeah, and I think that is very important, what you're saying, Petri, because our customers really require very high accuracy.
Yeah, splendid. I'd like to talk a little bit about the return track here. So when you create the contract state at any given time, you're saving that in a time series database. We're using watsonx.data in this case. That's terrific. What's the dashboarding tool? Or like, how do you then communicate both the structured data back through the API? Because you mentioned that was the return path to Samporten. And then what's the dashboarding solution that you're showing to your customers?
Yeah, so for this case, the contract intelligence, it's mostly about the value, making sure that we find everything that should be invoiced. We know what's included in the contract and what's not. One very important thing is understanding when it needs to be renewed. So if the landlord wants to make changes, they have a certain time frame that when they can do that, and whether they want to renew or don't want to renew that. So for this contract intelligence use case, it's mostly structured data, and we have actually built for this use case a custom dashboard that can display this information quite nicely. For some other use cases, and before we had been able to complete the dashboard, we used Kibana for the visualization, but turns out that there's some things that are a bit difficult to implement with Kibana. So to reach the usability level that we were looking for, we had to cook our own.
And I'd also add to that, Petri, correct me if I'm wrong, but we also have a use case now with invoice intelligence, where they actually just want the values transported to their own system.
Yes, and of course the unstructured data that you mentioned, that it's already in Samporten, so we link the structure that we have built back to that, and of course this entire contract intelligence, the lower box, is available as a service through a REST API, so it doesn't need to be bound to Samporten, but that the Samporten is a very good platform for our original use case, and it's still being used, and it's a very good match for instance, construction related use cases and property related use cases. So that's why it's highlighted here. But there might be cases where a customer already has a document management system or CRM or ERP, where there's already documents in some other system. So then we are able to integrate through that, or crawl SharePoint, for instance, and process the documents from there. And that's actually one of the very good points of Watsonx data. So we can integrate, bring in all of the data and then process it in place, so we don't need to move it around and build ETL pipelines and those kinds of things. so we can go where the data is and then just enrich it.
The lessons learned, right? You were just talking about like, part of your architecture allows you to, not move the data, like minimize ETL pipelines, et cetera. But can you talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned as you built your system?
Sometimes when you start building a solution, you might have a very concrete plan. It's a bit more rigid, but then as we heard about the cloud and on-prem and everything that's going on in the world and geopolitical situations, you start getting other requirements. And that, of course, also links to the data, where and how you process the data. So I would say that our journey has forced us to just become more and more adaptable to all of these different requirements, because it feels like today that to customers they're not like similar. They have their own wishes and so on, and you need to be able to accommodate that to be successful, because if you are too cemented and too much of a box and you can't move away from that, it's very difficult to scale. So with that said, everything has become so flexible, from the cloud to on-prem to hybrid, and then we process the data. And maybe you can mention that a bit as well, Petri, with the containers and how to automate those, and just press a button and everything should go so quickly. So that has been a journey. So it's fun to see how things evolve with all of these requirements that are hitting us every day.
It's a mark of a company that pays attention to their customers, where you can adjust it. But and Petri, I'll tag you on this next one as well. Because it reflects also what Katarina was saying, in that you start with contract intelligence, and then your customers say, "Hey, but we also want to process invoices." And yes, important is great, but we also have everything over here in OneDrive. So now your system needs to, as Katarina was saying, it needs to adapt to like myriad different requirements. And so your architecture has to be both flexible, right, and modular. So you can also swap out pieces of tech. What was an example of how you used that modular design to your advantage?
Oh, that's an excellent question. From the beginning, it was quite obvious that we needed to build a sort of a service-oriented model where we are able to, split each component and as you said, switch them if we need to. And we sort of got hit by a shovel with a shovel of requirements quite quickly. So as you know, we're from the Nordics, and in here our typical customer size is quite small, especially in the public sector. It might be 5 users that are working with 100 documents to start with. And then when you come across to the US, they have 70 locations in different geographic locations where they want to, scale the solution out and make it easily deployable and so on and so forth. So building the architecture from the beginning to allow that has been a very very good decision in hindsight. And as for the pluggability goes, for instance, let's talk about the contract intelligence versus the invoice intelligence. I mean, we call our AI a document AI, where it can detect what's important and extract that. But then the contracts and the invoices have quite different, all the same but different bits that are important in them. So being able to pull the contract intelligence analysis module out of the processing pipeline and plug in an invoice handling module, just like that, is very useful in these cases. The AI can extract anything you want. It's just about understanding what you need and then building the modules to handle that downstream.
Gotcha. Let's go ahead and start to wrap up here. There are a couple things that I did want to ask about. But Katarina, can you just run us through a couple of the big customer impacts that your system was able to deliver for folks, right? That's like the spiking of the football here, to use an American metaphor.
I mean, the biggest impact now for our customers is that they can do this type of prognosis. They have the common calculation models. They steer reduced manual handling, so information getting lost. They get better data quality. And when they also stabilize their finances, they also have a better position when they're talking with their banks, if they want to loan money. It's also easier to scale. So if they are going to do management for a new building, it's so much easier to just digest those contracts. Those are the highlights of our solution.
The scaling one jumps off the page at me. Like if you've got a way to manage all of your documents and you've got hundreds of them, then this would help you do thousands for sure. Petri, if you could take us through what's next for the platform.
Yeah, I think there's two different main things. So as a platform, we are looking at using the Power 11 that's coming out to make solution available as a single box on-prem solution. It's looking super impressive and very useful for this use case. And also then on the functionality side, we're thinking about, the agentic AI is all the rage these days. So we're looking at, once you're able to understand the contracts and things you have, what do you want to do about that? Is there something that we can automate? I'll take care for you. Yeah, stay tuned.
You've just set the hook then for another session with the three of us in 6 or 9 months time, or whenever you give me a call and let me know you're ready. Thank you both very, very much for joining me today. Thanks for walking us through the solution and the work that you've done. And so with that, we can go ahead and wrap. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.